Hey, everybody. Welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have author and NYU professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat back with us today. We'll chat with her in just a second. But first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a professor of history at New York University. She writes about fascism, authoritarianism, and propaganda. She is the recipient of Guggenheim and other fellowships, an advisor to protect democracy, an MSNBC opinion columnist and television commentator, and publishes Lucid, a newsletter on threats to democracy. Her latest book, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, looks at how illiberal leaders use propaganda, corruption, violence, and machismo, and how they can be defeated. Ruth, welcome back into the back room.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So let's get right into all the craziness that's going on. You wrote the 2021 New York Times bestselling book, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. And here we are just a few short years later in 2025, facing an unprecedented authoritarian turn in American politics. Let's start with the latest example of Donald Trump's autocratic assault. What concerns you most about what we're witnessing in Los Angeles with regard to his federalization of the National Guard and his deployment of 700 U.S. Marines without the request or consent of Governor Gavin Newsom?
I mean, there's a couple of things. This is obviously Donald Trump's. So authoritarianism is one basic definition is the executive branch wants to expand and overwhelm the powers of other, judiciary, of the media, of like institutions, but also state and local powers and authorities. And also Donald Trump has been trying to delegitimize any Democratic official or a Democratic foreign head of state. Remember, he demoted Justin Trudeau to a U.S. governor. So what he's trying to do to kind of trample the powers of Governor Newsom is typical. So there's that. Obviously, I'm also been watching how the militarized response to these scattered protests in Los Angeles has been wildly disproportionate, and that's to kind of they tried to create a crisis of saying that these protests are endangering civilization. So they're going into like one of the oldest authoritarian scams. Is you create a crisis, you say foreigners are coming over the border to commit mayhem, you get people into a situation of feeling existential fear, for their safety, and then you use that to justify a state crackdown. So I'm really obviously concerned about that.
And another obvious concern and fear is that Trump is now attempting to use the military domestically to stop dissent. Is that what's happening here?
Donald Trump has made no secret for years about his desire to use the military in a more authoritarian way, specifically to have the military loyal not to the Constitution, as happens in democracies, but to his person, and to be loyal to do whatever he'd like them to do, which is why he's got the loyalist Pete Hegseth there. And it's very symbolic that they've been trying to depict these protests, again, as a kind of transnational criminal assault on America. They're saying that, criminal illegal aliens inside, so we've got an enemy inside the country that's in collusion with transnational terrorist gangs, and they're all converging in LA. And that's why it's very symbolic that they've got the Marines. This is a storied infantry battalion that has fought in Afghanistan, Kuwait, Iraq, and Kristi Noem is actually using the language of regime change, saying we're going to liberate, the reason we're there is we're going to liberate Los Angeles from corrupt local and also California government. And so the Marines, it's as though LA was Iraq. And so what these authoritarians do is they bring the war home, right? They turn the instruments of war on their own people. And for that, you need the military. And that's obviously, considering a third of my book's on military coups and authoritarian misuse of the military, it's unbelievable to watch my hometown. I'm from LA. being this kind of stage set for this. It's a testing ground for the improper use of the military.
And speaking of that improper use, we've seen him speak to troops recently. He's given an address at Fort Bragg. There's been other addresses. And we've seen an unprecedented politicization of the military. And that's really alarming.
Totally. And what he's been doing is creating the images that show the desired role of the military, so that it is a politicized military. Wearing a MAGA cap to speak at West Point, the content and tone of his speech at Fort Bragg. The military, for authoritarians, become props. And so it was very interesting that the turnout for his storied military parade on his birthday, that was very obvious to everyone, right? It was the Army's 250th anniversary. And that deserves to be celebrated. And the Army was going to celebrate it in a very different way, as a festival, and it wasn't going to be a parade in Washington. But of course, it was Donald Trump's birthday, and the dictator's birthday must be celebrated. But in fact, very few people came, and he did not get the authoritarian spectacle. It was very interesting to me that the Army was not marching in a very enthusiastic way. At times, it looked like the soldiers were almost shuffling. And we have a very competent military, the most powerful, one of the most professional militaries in the entire world. So I'm pondering that failure as a spectacle, and yet he got the kind of spectacle of military force arrayed for him on his birthday, because authoritarians need spectacles of choreographed bodies. In this case, it was military, but it's often civilian at the rallies, and it makes them feel powerful.
Well, there's reports that he's really annoyed with Hegseth because of what you just said in terms of the military. The troops actually marching were kind of like smiling and waving, like they didn't project the terror, the kind of fear that he wanted to project. Like, this is my military, and if you don't watch it, I'm going to use these troops against you. And so he kept saying the tone of what the troops were doing was wrong, which is really interesting.
To add, it's actually a positive thing that the military did not was either given instructions or just coming from each one of the people involved, did not want to project that kind of fearsome authoritarian image. They chose to march a certain way. They chose to smile and wave. They chose to wave the drone in the drone parade part over their heads in a way that many military observers thought would be mocked abroad. They didn't want to lend themselves, we could speculate, to this authoritarian use of the military.
It's just ironic that he branded this as a celebration, the 250th anniversary of the Army, and the troops, that was the tone. They were in celebratory mode, and he's pissed off because, of course, that's not what this parade was all about.
Exactly.
So Trump has attacked the media. He's attacked law firms, judges, prosecutors, district attorneys, attorneys general, universities. There's an assault on due process. People have been rounded up and disappeared by unidentified masked men with white vans. Investigations have been opened into opponents and perceived enemies, from James Comey to Bruce Springsteen. A judge and Democratic politicians have been arrested and or indicted. And now we have U.S. troops in an American city and a president who threw himself a Kim Jong-un style military parade. How does all of that track with other democracies in history that ultimately fell to authoritarianism?
Well, it tracks in that, today there are fewer coups. There's actually a little revival in other parts of the world of coups. And Donald Trump tried to have his own self-coup, January 6th. But usually autocrats come to power via elections. And so it takes time. And we've actually, everything that's happened in the last months is far quicker, far more kind of speedier, like a blitzkrieg, really, compared to the first months of the autocrats we know who came through elections, such as, Putin or Erdogan or Orban. They didn't do so many things in their first months. And every one of these things is an aggression on rule of law, on the way that democracies look. And Donald Trump is a man of the image. So every time they generate images of manhandling elected officials or arresting judges, this is also deliberate, trying to remake the country in Trump's authoritarian image. And I look at this having studied the rise of fascism, and my specialty was not Hitler, although I know a lot about Hitler too. It was Mussolini, who spent 3 years as a prime minister who was appointed. He didn't do a coup. And then he declared a dictatorship. And so I can't help, it's 100 years ago, but they do the same things. So it's like a drip, drip. First you have this violation, you arrest a judge. Then you manhandle a senator. Now you've done a city comptroller. And these people are just trying to exercise democratic understandings of the law. Brad Lander was manhandled and arrested for asking the ICE agents for a warrant. So a warrant is a very democratic concept. And the idea is that you can't just come like secret police and break into things and do things and break into properties. You have to show a warrant. But that's not how authoritarians think. So it's like there's a slow path to eroding with each of these actions the whole institution of democracy.
And are we either headed towards or maybe already in, on some level, the kind of autocracy that exists like in Hungary? People think when they, fear Donald Trump becoming a dictator, what comes to mind? Mussolini and Hitler and, Xi and people like that, and Putin. But it just seems like what he's pushing for is to have an America that's modeled after Hungary, where people go out to cafes, everybody's having fun, people go buy cars, there's elections, it looks and smells like a democracy, but it's not. Is that what we really have to fear here?
That's part of it, but he actually wants something far more violent, because more like Turkey of Erdogan. In fact, the double tragedy when she's now released, but the Tufts graduate student, that viral footage of, she's going about her day, and then she's surrounded by these thugs who are in plain clothes and masked, and the sight of these men who surround her and take her away. This is what they do in Turkey. Erdogan does it inside Turkey. You're just minding your own business. But if you're targeted as an enemy of the state, then masked men come, they're dressed in black, they surround you, and they put you in an unmarked van, and away you go. And he also does this to Turks in exile. He's done this in 18 countries. So when I looked at that as a historian of autocracy, I was like, oh my God, this woman, she's Turkish. And this is happening to her in America. And also, Orban has not used the US military in this way. So we also have the problem that Hungary does not, of militias, of 450 million guns in circulations in private hands. And we already had an insurrection, an attempt to violently overthrow the US government. So America is it's one of the most violent countries in the world. And so any authoritarian, government that comes into being is going to be worse than Hungary in that way.
Mm-hmm. His military parade was Saturday, but also on that day, we saw the juxtaposition of that and the No Kings protests. From a historical perspective, how effective are such demonstrations in ultimately pushing back and resisting authoritarians?
So really, the big story of that weekend was not just the military parade, of course, but the highly, highly successful No Kings protests. And, it's notoriously hard to have a firm figure for participation, but many media outlets are saying it's 5 million people, right? And this is hugely important because for two reasons. One of the most successful things you can do against autocracy is have mass nonviolent demonstrations. And the vast majority of the No Kings protests, like the LA protests, were nonviolent. And the other thing is that today, I really think that, especially in a country as big as the US, protest is going to be decentralized. As well, we may have a centralized march in DC or some other big city, but it's going to be decentralized. And that's what those protests were. And you have to think of them as building a movement over time. And so what matters is that the No Kings protests were way bigger than the already big and successful hands-off protests in April. So a movement is building, something is happening. And every time people who might be think of, oh, I'm not a protester, I'm not someone who comes out in the streets, or I'm scared, when they see numbers of people protesting, and it was also joyous. People had signs, they had, jokey signs, they did all kinds of things. Being together, we know this from the history of protests, feels good. It gives you a moral purpose, and you're doing it together. And so this is why protest is so threatening to authoritarians. And I really believe that one reason that the MAGA and Trump had such a wild, disproportionate response in Los Angeles is that the sight of ordinary people spontaneously coming out of their houses this has been happening all over the country, to help to protect the vulnerable, to stop the ICE deportations. They would just come out of their homes. We've seen this all over the nation again. And this is very threatening because it's solidarity, it's empathy, it's collective action on a small level. So I'm tracking these No Kings protests and the development of a U.S. pro-democracy movement through protest and other actions very carefully.
Yeah, and I saw a statistic or a piece of information I thought was really interesting, in that Saturday's protests amounted to maybe 1.8% or something like that of the American public. But when you reach 3%,
yes,
it becomes a real inflection point, and you can actually defeat this kind of tyranny.
Yeah, it's actually 3.5%. And this is the work of Erica Chenoweth, a brilliant political scientist at Harvard, who came up, and being a political scientist can do this giant database of the history of resistance, something that a historian like myself couldn't do, and has shown that in other countries, other times and places, if it's at the right time, and sometimes that's when you've had a real regime and it's weakening, like at the end of communism, for example, then just 3.5% of the population mobilizing can make a huge difference. And one reason that is the more people are out, the more there's safety in numbers. And you also get elites, whether it's business elites or religious elites or people who, and this again in a regime context, people who have been collaborating with power. They start to see that history is actually not on their side, that so many people are out there and there's a momentum that it's not in their interest to collude with the leader and support the leader, which is why they did that, support in the first place. They thought that he was going to be omnipotent, unbeatable. And so they better get on the right side. You mentioned the law firms and all the other, Jeff Bezos, there's all this collusion. But when you have a sustained protest movement that builds to be in their research of Chenoweth, 3.5%, sometimes or often you can tip the scale and start a different trajectory of history.
People need to be out there.
Yes, that's the lesson. People need to be, and there's safety in numbers.
Last question. How can your book serve as a guide for navigating through this existential crisis?
I think one of the things that was not very fun about writing the book is that I had to get into the heads and understand how these guys think. And it's a very bleak, place to dwell. But there's lots of lessons from it, because over and over we see people believe the propaganda and the promises of these rulers. They're going to keep peace in the world. They love them. They say that they love, even Donald Trump even said, "I love you" on January 6th and other occasions. But my book shows that these strongmen really just see people, their people, as props to use and discard. And Trump even told Americans that. And this is not in my book because it's more recent. In Iowa during the campaign, he told Iowans it was sub-zero temperatures, and he said, and they wanted them to come out and caucus for him, even if they were sick. And he said, if you come out and vote for me and then you pass away, it will be worth it. And that's a central message of my book, Strongmen, that they don't care about you and they use you, and they bring ruin to societies. And so I wrote the book to dismantle and debunk these myths that it's more efficient. One man rule is more efficient. It's more productive. They get things done. They make the trains run on time. So I wanted to expose the total ruination that comes to societies when they follow these strongmen.
Well, great lessons and great advice for all of us. Ruth, great insights as always. Come back soon.
Thank you. It'd be a pleasure.
Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.